Hi, welcome to Substance Painter for modelers. Substance Painter is a really powerful texturing tool that can be very useful for modelers that just want to make their models a little bit better, make their turntables or their renders look a little nicer than just a wireframe. There's a lot of great material for Substance Painter out there, but when I was first starting, I was a little overwhelmed by how complex this program was. And so what these tutorials are going to be for is to show you how even as a modeler with very little understanding of texturing, you can still use Substance Painter to get something that looks quite nice quite quickly. There is a lot of great material out there if you want a more in-depth look at Substance Painter, because obviously I'm not going to cover a lot of things. The company that makes Substance Painter, Allegorithmic, has great resources on YouTube, and I highly recommend you check those out. But this is going to be just a brief overview on how, as a modeler, you can get something from nothing to looking good pretty quickly without pulling all your hair out. So I'm going to be working in Maya. Well, starting off from a model I made in Maya of this old 1920s telephone. Here's my reference, so this is what I'm hoping it'll look like at the end. First, I'm going to go over some things that you want to make sure your model has in Maya to make your life a lot easier when you get to Substance Painter. So, Substance Painter doesn't use subdivision schemes. So, if you're used to working with Catt-Clark schemes or the 3-key in Maya, Substance Painter won't take that into account. Substance Painter will also start to lag and go slower the more geometry you have, so it's usually recommended to try to keep your objects not too heavy, to just make life easier on yourself and so that everything's not lagging all the time. So here's my model. It's kind of in that spot right in between low poly and high poly. You can see that I don't have any beveling or fencing because that won't come in handy anyways. Just really quickly, for those of you who have always used Catt-Clark subdivision systems and are just screaming in angst right now, one way that you can kind of make sure your model looks the way it does without using that is to use Maya's edge softening and hardening functions. So for example, if we look at this little knob here, you can see it's got that wonky faceting happening. And normally you could 3-key that out, but obviously we're not using a Catt-Clark subdivision scheme. So in this case, what we would want to do is grab all these edges here, the ones that look wonky, and then you're gonna hold down Shift, right click, and right here you've got the Soften Harden Edge button, and just select Soften Edge. So now you can see those are displaying correctly. It's made all our edges nice and soft. And then you can do the opposite. Up here, I want this to have a nice sharp edge, but obviously I can't bevel or fence it. So I'm going to grab this edge, Shift, right click, Soften Harden Edge, and I'm going to choose Harden Edge this time. And now it's done that and has given me a nice sharp line. So Substance Painter will be able to take those into account when you import this model. So make sure that your model doesn't have any of that wacky faceting. And if you're kind of angsting about not being able to use fences or bevels, that's a pretty good way to start making sure your model looks the way it does without using any kind of subdivision schemes. So Substance Painter is able to bake out a whole bunch of maps, normal maps, ID maps, and we'll get to what all of those are later on here in a little bit. So I'm going to have two versions of my model. I have this version here, which is the low poly mode, and then I've also got a high poly version. So the high poly has some extra details that I like, but that I didn't want in there cluttering up my model. For example, these little ridges, these little screws over here, the ridges on these guys. They're nice little touches that I want to keep, but that I don't want in my model. So that's what my high poly model's got. The other difference is that my low poly model is all one object, so it's all been merged together, and my high poly model has stayed separate. I've separated it, however, instead of by object, by material. So this allows me to, before I even get into Substance Painter, figure out which parts of this are going to be what. So these are rubber, here we have the metal screws, the regular metal, the body of the telephone, which is a kind of polished metal, the wooden handle, the wire of the phone, the plastic tube, the painted wood, which is the dial in the middle here, and the rusted metal, which is these little back plates. So that's how I've got my two different pieces of geometry set up here. The other thing we're going to look at really quick before we dive into Substance Painter is UVs. So one of the great things about Substance Painter is it lets you make very different materials using only one shader. So in this case, I've got everything on one UV map right here. And so I'm going to be able to, with one shader that I made in Substance, make the wood and the metal and the polished metal and the cord and on and on and on, which is why I've got everything in one UV set. Now, Substance does have the ability to make texture sets, which let you make different shaders for different parts of an object. I'm not going to do that in this tutorial because it's just one phone, and so I really want my one asset to have just one shader assigned to it, and that way I'm not juggling loads and loads of texture maps for something so simple. The one thing that you want to make sure that the few things that you want to make sure that you look out for with your UVs are, first of all, that all pieces of the same material, and preferably the whole thing, are all scaled similarly. So you can see here there's very little size discrepancy, apart from the cord, which is kind of an outlier, but between the metal rotary dials and the body and the wooden handle, my UVs are pretty much all proportional across this, and that's going to help us with all of our procedural textures. The other thing we want to make sure is to watch for directionality. So I want for all the parts of my phone to be vertically up and down the same. So for example, I want all the pieces of the body to have the top up here and the bottom down here. And that'll make sure that if I have any kind of grain happening in this texture, that I don't end up in a situation where the grain is going up and down on the body, but then side to side on the foot of the telephone, which would just look wacky. So those are the two things to look out for in your UVs. And then just very quickly, so this is my low poly, my high poly, you'll notice UVs are all over the place. Because the low poly is what we're going to be texturing, it's also what I'm going to be rendering from, that's really the only thing that needs to be UV'd. So I'm going to export these two out as OBJs, and we're going to be able to go into Substance Painter. So here's my low poly. And then for the high poly, like I mentioned, I want to make sure that I don't merge all these together. So there we go. And now on to Substance Painter. Alright, so now that we've got everything all ready to go in Maya, it's time to switch over to Substance Painter. So this is the default interface, and the first thing we're going to do is head over to File and say New. So right away this little dialog box pops up. The first question it wants to know is what kind of template we want to use. So this is how you want Substance Painter to look at the shader you're going to make. So you can choose whether you want it to be specular glossiness or metallic roughness, if you want it specifically for Unity or Unreal Engine. I like to use Unreal Engine because it's a metallic roughness workflow, and I'm kind of used to that, so that's what we're going to go with. For mesh, I'm going to select my low poly mesh right here. This is if we're using UDIM tiles, we're not, so we can leave that unchecked. The normal map format and the tangent space you can leave the way they are as default. Your document resolution is the size you're going to want your maps to be, and as it says right here, you can change those at any time, and that includes bringing them up in resolution without losing any definition. I like to set this to 4K to begin with because, well, why not? This is where we would add if we had any normal maps we'd baked from ZBrush or XNormal beforehand. We don't have any of those, so we're going to leave those blank. And here we are. So to navigate in your material modes, these just use the Maya settings as default. So that's how we get around, and I'm just going to go through a real quick tour of what all these boxes are, and then we'll get to the actual texturing part. So first of all, in these two viewports, we've got the 3D view and the UV view. You can toggle between these by using F1, F2, and F3. F1 keeps them both up. F2 will show you just the 3D, and F3 will show you just the UV. Most of the time, you'll be in F1 mode with both of them. Then up here, we've got all of our different tools. So these guys are all different painting tools. You've got symmetry, color picker. Over here, you've got projector, polyfill, eraser, paintbrush, and then over here you've got rendering tools if you're using Substance Painter's iRay. And then right here you've got your lazy mouse, you've got some links to export to Photoshop or to get to Substance Share. Then over here in these boxes, you've got your layers. If you're at all familiar with Photoshop, this is going to look real familiar to you. The one difference is that here we've got a drop-down menu that lets us look at all of our different channels and lets us select each of them to work with them individually. Underneath that, we've got the texture set settings, and this is going to tell us a lot about our texture. So we've got the size, and we've got, again, our channels. So for anyone who's a little confused about your channels are the different maps that will be exported out of Substance Painter and that will all come together in your render engine to create the material or the shader. So in this case, I'm going to export a base color map, a height map, a roughness map, a metallic map, and a normal map. In this case, they're all called channels. And so editing all of these individually or as a group is how we'll be creating our shader in Substance Painter. Then underneath here, we've got additional maps that we can bake, and we'll be getting to those later. They're really useful. Up here, your texture set list is for your different texture sets. This can be used if you're going to be making multiple shaders in one project. As I said earlier though, I'm only making the one, so I've only got one thing in here. And then finally we've got our tool properties. So right now I'm on the paintbrush, as you can see it's selected up here. And so I've got first my brush properties, so we can see the size, the shape of it, how hard or soft it is, the angle, and all that jazz that's going to be pretty familiar to you if you have ever worked in Photoshop. Your stencil, which I don't have one selected, and then material is what you're painting with. So right now, if I were to paint on my layer, I would be painting not with a material, but with these channels. So white in my base color channel, 0 in my height channel, and so on and so forth. So that's your toolbar over here. And then finally, we've got the shelf, which is really all your utilities. So you've got your alphas, which can be used as stamps or as brushes, grunge maps, procedural maps, texture maps, hard surface maps, filters, which are like Photoshop filters. They can be used to tweak something you already have, brushes, which are like Photoshop brushes, particles, which are really cool dynamically procedurally created brushes, tools, which are more specific options, materials, which are a library of pre-made materials that come in Substance. We'll be using these guys a lot. Smart materials, which are also a library of a different kind of pre-made material, which we'll be talking about a lot as well. Smart masks, which are ways that you can mask your different layers inside your channel box. We'll be using these a lot as well. Environments. These are what inform how Substance lights your scene. By default, it's set to panorama right here, and that's what I'm going to keep it as. You can always try changing these out if you have something that's highly reflective, or if you want to make sure that your environment looks like how the scene that you're going to be putting this in. And then we've got color profiles. For the last thing, we've got these two tabs over here. So you've got your texture set settings, you've got your display settings, so these change your camera, and then all the rest of these are pretty self-explanatory. You've got post-processing effects that are really useful when you're rendering, a little less useful right now, and you can change your color profile. And then your viewer settings talks about how you'll be seeing right here. So we've got, as I mentioned, the default environment map, which we can switch out for one of these, and you'll see if I switch it, for example, to the cave entrance, that definitely changes my lighting. So be conscious of that if you're thinking, like, why does this look so strange when I export it anywhere else? Make sure you're lighting with something that kind of looks the way you'll be lighting in the end. So I like the panorama one. We can change how opaque the environment is if we want to see it, which I don't. Exposure if we want it to be brighter or less bright. Rotation if we want the sun shining. This is useful for checking out your specular on your object. And then the blur. And then this is what shader we've got. So we have a physically based render with metal and rough. This can be changed, though that gets a little wonky, so I wouldn't recommend it. Back to our texture set settings, and now we're ready to get texturing. Alright, so first things first, we're going to talk a little bit about layers because these are really how we'll be constructing our whole shader. So the buttons I'm mostly going to be using in this panel are the drop down to switch between my different channels, this right here which creates a new layer, this guy which creates a new fill layer, and then over here the folder to make groups, and the trash can to delete. So first of all, if we click over here, this creates a completely blank layer. Now we can see that it's blank across all of our different channels, so there's really nothing on here. I'm going to start by getting some red and painting on it. So I can paint both on my material mode and on my UV mode. Now you will notice, first of all, that when I'm painting on my UVs, Substance is behaving as though I was painting across my model. So we've got the red kind of streaking up here. This is very nice if you're trying to get dirt or any kind of interaction, because without pulling your hair out too much, even on your UVs, you can get that sort of interaction and you don't get the weird 3D seams. However, if you were hoping to use your UVs to paint only on this back piece, and this is exactly what you don't want, what you can do is come over here to your paint settings. Under alignment, right now we have tangent wrap, so it'll be wrapping around our objects. If we set that to UV, now it will only paint on the UVs and it won't look at the 3D object at all. Then here we've got the size space, which means that the size of our brush will change dependent on object size. You can also change it to viewport size so that your brush always stays the same no matter how much you zoom in or out, or to texture size so that your texture changes size depending on what your UV size is like. So you can see here it's staying about the same size because my UVs are all the same. If I come over to my chord, it gets much bigger because the UVs on that are much smaller. So that's a little bit about using the brush. Now do note over here I just changed my base color to red, but I could also change any of these other ones, because right now, since my base color is red and everything else is default, all we're seeing is that my color is changing to red. If I pulled up the height though, and then maybe made it a little bit metallic, and we can see the changes up here, made it a little more shiny. Now when I paint on here, we'll see I'm painting shiny red, and it's bumping up. So this is the difference between painting on just one channel and painting on multiple channels. So right now if we look right here in our base color, we can see I've painted on it. If we switch to our height, we can also see in the preview that I've painted on it. Another good quick way to see what you've painted on is to use the C key to toggle between channels. So this is my base color channel. You can see there's nothing anywhere except where I've painted the red. The height, same thing. Roughness, metallic, normal, combine normals, and then I'm going to hit M again to get back to my combined material. So this right here on your paintbrush allows you to choose those different things. As you saw when I was flipping through my channels, even though I didn't change the normal, it's still painted onto here. So now if you want to make sure, say you want to paint really just your color, you don't want to paint any of these other guys, you can use these buttons up here to click them on and off. So if I want to paint just, let's say just metal, there we go. Now I'll only be painting the metallic attribute. I'm going to hit M to go back to my materials. And over here I'm going to come in and I'm going to make this corner more metallic. Now you can see my color's not changing, my height's not changing, my roughness isn't changing, really just the metallicness is changing. And now, if I flip through my channels, you can see that that patch is completely invisible in anything that isn't my metallic attribute. Then of course you can use any combination of these to get really, really high amounts of control as you're painting. So that's what working with just a regular layer is like. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is using a fill layer. So this right here is a fill layer. Now, just like with our red brush, once we make a fill layer, we have a whole bunch of questions for, well, one question for each of our channels. What base color do you want, what height, what roughness, what metallic, and what normal. So with these, we can click here and change it, and you'll see it fills in the whole thing. And once again, we can change all of these individually to really get the look that we want. We also up here can change the UV scaling, the UV offset, or the UV rotation to get a little more control on our paint. And if instead of wanting to paint just one base texture, because honestly this is about as boring as it gets, you can click on these buttons, see how they change color when I hover over them, and these will let you choose one of Substance Painter's texture maps, or alphas, or one that you've imported, and it will use that to color it instead. So let's say I want to color this, we're going to use this grunge map here. So now we can see where my color is, it's got the grunge map. Because it's only in that color setting, you can see it doesn't affect any other aspects of it. It's really just changing my color. And now if I change these scale things, these scale sliders, or these offset sliders, we'll see a difference in the texture. Now I can also choose, say I want to keep the base color white, but I want some changes in the roughness, I could do the same thing. I'm going to use this crystal procedural, and now we can see just the roughness is being changed according to that texture that I've got plugged in, while the rest of the attributes don't change. So then of course we can plug in multiple ones. Let's plug in the crystal one in here again. And now you can see they kind of line up, so we've got our color and our roughness changing without our metallic and normal changing. I'm gonna flip all these back to just a nice cherry red. So now what using fill layers hinges on is the ability to mask the layers, because obviously just filling your whole asset one color, not super duper helpful. So what you can do is right click on this layer, and then you can add masks. So you can add a white mask, which will by default show everything, and painting black on it will hide things. So right now we're hiding the red and showing our base layer. We can add a black mask, which will by default hide everything, and then we have to paint on it in white to reveal what we've got underneath it. So if we've got our mask here, we can either paint to reveal our texture, or we can right click on this and then add a fill from down here. And what this will allow us to do is to fill in this whole thing with a texture if we wanted to. So let's choose our checkers, and now we can see it has filled in our whole mask with this grayscale that I've just plugged into it. So that's pretty neat. What's really neat here is that I can also go back in at any time and change this. Since my mask is still there, the placement of everything is unaffected, and I just keep my checker pattern, which I can change to a uniform color or to really basically whatever else I want. So I'm going to be using these fill layers a lot just because I changed my mind, and I like being able to, at the last minute, look at this and say, hey wait, I didn't want that to be green, I wanted it to be yellow. So that's a little bit about layers. Layers also have, before I forget, a few other things you can put on them. I can add paint, which will work with this fill to also give me the ability to paint on it. So now I'm compounding my paint strokes with my fill bucket. I can add a filter, which as I mentioned earlier, will give us a set of Photoshop-like filters, for example the blur, which will affect the different things that are on my mask. I can add levels, which are just like Photoshop levels. There we go, you can see how that's changing. And then I can also add a generator or color selection or anchor point, which I'll get into later. Note that all of these, they only show up when I click on my mask, so that means that they're affecting the mask. If I wanted to affect this base color, I would have to click over here, right click, and then once again I can add all of these. So I can add paint if I also want to paint on this layer. And there once again we're seeing that it's cutting through underneath the mask, which I guess we would see better if I turned off these levels on here. And we can again add a fill, add levels, and all that good stuff. These little dots here are exactly what they look like. They allow you to turn on and off different things. so you can check out what the different pieces of your paint look like and what you're trying to get to. So here you're really getting to the base of what Substance Painter does, which is it allows you to manipulate every different part of your shader independently in a very non-destructive way. So you can always go back and always change what's at the bottom of your shader without losing what you've built off of it. Now, the last thing we're going to go into about layers before I skip on is exactly what you can do thanks to this drop-down that lets you select different channels. So when I was working earlier, you mostly saw me editing all those different channels, but I was hanging out in this base color channel. So the main reason I do that is that the base color channel gives you previews based on your base color, which are a little easier to understand when you're looking at them than, say, height information is. So those help me keep track of my layers better. But what the drop downs allow you to do is to manipulate things like the layer blending mode and the layer opacity on just a per channel base. So to test this out, I'm going to grab another material from here. I'm going to go with the plastic. And so right now on my base color, I can see I've got this blue, and I can change the opacity of my plastic, but you can see no matter how much I turn down the blue, the texture of the plastic remains. That's because I'm in my base color channel, and so I'm only going to be affecting my base color. Now, if I were to switch to the roughness channel, you'll see now my preview is no longer blue. It's black because that's what my roughness information is at. And if I turn down the opacity on this, my color remains, but my roughness information has just gone back to default because I've hidden this entirely. So that gives you an extra amount of control on things that you can do just by switching through these channels. Now the layer blending modes are a lot like what you'll know if you've used Photoshop, so I'm going to show you how those can be used really quickly as well. I'm going to add a new fill layer, and for the base color I'm going to put one of these tiling patterns. I'm going to use the checkers again. And right now we can see that this is just, I'm going to flip it to only color. So it's keeping the height, rough, and metal information from my plastic down here, and just the color is being changed by this layer because this layer only has the color attribute. Now I can turn this up or down, bringing us back to the blue, and once again, I'm not altering any of the other channels. If I switch this back up, I can use these blending modes the way I would in Photoshop. So for example, if I switch this to multiply, my white is showing through while my black information is remaining the same. And once again, since I'm using the multiply just on the base color layer, it is only affecting that. And then you can kind of try all these different ones. They'll all give you different results, and these can be very helpful when trying to tweak colors or tweak grime to get exactly what you want. Now, let's say that instead of color on this new fill layer that I have, we just have height information. So I'm going to take my height and I'm actually going to put a checker pattern in that as well. So we can see here on the base color there's nothing because I'm not filling it in with a base color. I'm just filling it in with this height information. If I switch to height, then I once again have all of these options. These will be a little harder to notice on the height information, especially because I don't have anything on here. I'm going to add height really quick here so it has something to blend with. But we can see that once again, by altering these, I'm altering the way it's interpreting my height map, and only my height map. And so that's, I think, really all of the basic information on layers. Now we're going to start talking about maps, and we'll be able to get into some actual texturing goodness, even though I promised we'd do that like 7 minutes ago. So the maps that I keep talking about are down here. And what these maps do is they allow Substance Painter to understand things about your model that will help it calculate things like smart materials and smart masks. So what we're going to do is we're going to click Bake Textures down here, and we're going to get this little dialog box. So its first question is about output size. So this is what size maps do I want to be baking. So I set my project to 4K, so I'm going to set these to 4K as well. Most of these settings you can leave as they are. What you do need to enter though, however, is your high definition mesh if you have one. If you don't, just leave it as is and all is well. I do have a high definition mesh though, so I'm going to grab that. And we can see now it says high on these little maps here. So that means that these maps will be baked referring to this model. So most of these don't have any parameters. One that you do want to change is ID map. So the ID map will make me a map that is based off all the different pieces of geometry that I had in my Maya file, which in this case are sorted based on what material I have. However, I'm going to want to make sure that for my color source, it's looking for polygroup ID, because since I didn't mesh all those, or merge all of those pieces of geometry, that's how it's going to find the different ones, and then I can leave the color generator as is. So now that we're all ready, we're going to click Bake Default Material Textures, and just let it go to town. This process can take a little while, and it will take longer depending on how high poly your mesh is, and how high def your maps are. Alright, there we go. So my baking is finished, and you can tell right away it's applied a little bit of AO now that it's done those maps. And down here we can see that things have been entered in all the map sections. So if we want to look at all of our maps, we can use the hotkey B for baked maps, and that'll let us toggle through all of these. So here's the normals that we've baked, and we can see it's put in handy dandy normals for all those pieces of geometry that I didn't have in here. But that were on my high def map. So we've got our screws, we've got the little ridges, we've got the little ridges over here. Then hitting B again, this is our world space normal. So for us, this doesn't tell us very much, but for Substance Painter, it'll use this to decide what is up, what is down, what is left, and what is right, which is useful for it for certain smart materials and smart masks. The ID map is based off of all those different pieces of geometry that I showed you in Maya. So we've got one ID map for each different type of material. We've got our, oh no, we've got our good old ambient occlusion right here, curvature, position, thickness, and normals. So I'm going to hit M to get back to my material. And now that we've got all that set up, we're pretty much ready to get rocking. So what I'm going to start with is going through some of the things that we can do with Substance Painter's pre-made materials and smart materials library, because really that's the kind of the best way to get things going very quickly and very easily in Substance Painter. What all these are down here are exactly what they sound like, preset textures. So materials and smart materials are both a preset shader that will change every different channel of your substance or your material. And you can tweak them, you can build on top of them, or build underneath them. So just as a show, I'm going to put this brass on here. And there we go. Quick brass. Now, once again, I can right click on this, I can add a mask. I can also add a mask with color selection now that I have my maps. This masks everything and gives me this little color selection node. Here, I've got my ID mask automatically plugged in, and I can pick a color and say I only want this brass to be on this material. So there we go. And then if I click the layer itself, not the mask, I can tweak these settings. So I want it to be a little bit lighter and maybe a little less metallic and a little. There we go. So that's working off of a material. Now a smart material is the same thing, except it takes into account your geometry by using the different masks we were looking at. So just for the sake of kind of showing this off, I'm going to go with this painted steel. And there we go. So we've got the steel applied, and you'll see that without me having to tell it anything, Substance Painter found my edges and the rounder parts, and it made it look like the paint had been worn off of those. So it did that using a combination of the maps we just baked, and that's just really neat because without having to do anything, it kind of figured out some of the most basic shading aspects for me. So this time you'll see, instead of being just one layer like this one was, we've got the little drop down arrow here, which means that it's a whole folder. So if I open those, I can see the different parts of this shader. So we've got the base steel down here, which has, again, all these different channels happening. We've got the metal details, and this one you can see when I click on here, there's no color, no metal, and no normal. It's just height and roughness. And the mask on that, which is what's giving it these good little divots on the metal. And then we've got the paint. And the paint is just changing the base color, the height, the roughness, and the metallic, which is what allows it to look like it's bumping up a little bit. And that is being masked off by this smart mask here, which is taking into account the ambient occlusion, the curvature, and all these other things that we've already baked out. And then it's using this texture to get that nice grunge feeling. So this right here is also what we can use to tweak what it's already given us. So for example, if we drop down the global balance, this will change the way that it's looking at those sides and the way that it's masking them, and so now we've got the paint is a lot less scraped off. It's kind of come back. If I make the balance a lot higher, you'll see the paint will get pulled back a lot. There we go. And so those will allow me to get some general tweaking in. And once again, I can alter any of these layers and any of these masks. So say I'm not sold on the red paint, I could change this to green. And then even if I click on this base color, I could change it to a different pattern. So I could change it to this cloud pattern. Now I've got cloud color paint on my telephone. So obviously that's not what I'm going for, so I'm going to delete these. But that's the basic idea between the materials and the smart materials. And you'll see that just by kind of mixing and matching those, we can get a lot of what we're looking for. So before I really get rolling on here, the last thing I'm going to go over, because I feel like I kind of did some weird skimming on this subject, is different ways that we can get our materials to be on different parts of our object. So I've got my fill layer here. I'm going to add a black mask to start, and I'm just going to really quickly show you different ways that you can change this mask. So you can paint directly on the mask. Now the one downside of that is that there's no way to quickly remove it or quickly tweak it. So to make sure you keep that non-destructive nature, you want to add paint and then paint on your mask. And then now you can see that if we click this little dot, it will hide or show back up. Using our different tools, we can also use our eraser, which is exactly what it sounds like. We can use this nifty thing here, which is a polygon fill, and that you'll see has a few different options. So right here we've got the triangle fill, which will allow us to select, and it will paint different triangles in the color that we have on our slider here. So right now I have it set to white. We can choose the polyfill, which will fill in a whole polygon. We can choose the geofill, which will fill in a whole mesh. Or we can use the UV fill, which will fill in just one UV'd bit. So in this case, it's filling in just this piece because that's just one UV segment here. And all of that is ways that I can change this paint map. I can hide it, I can show it, and I'm going to go back to my paintbrush. I can also use this right here, which is the projection tool. You'll see when I click on it, everything goes a little bit gray. I still have my brush, but if I paint, I'm just painting flat white. Now the way that I can fix that, or choose something to paint with, is if I go over here in my grayscale, and I'm going to choose a design that I want to stencil onto here, or project onto here. I'm going to go with this Groovy Atom. So now we can see it's taking up my whole screen. You want to hold down S to change that, so S right click up and down scales it, S left click allows you to rotate it. And now when I click through on here, it's using the color of my brush, so the black, which hides it, and it's just projecting on right through. So there's that, and that is how you use the projection tool. So I'm going to switch back to paintbrush, and I'm going to delete this paint because I do not like it. There we go. So now the other way to change how it's filtering or how it's masking is to either add a fill like we went over earlier, which allows you to either add a uniform grayscale or to choose a pattern, or we can add a mask with color selection, which will allow us to pick a color from our ID map. And all of those options that I just went through can be layered. So say I want this, but I also want to be getting just a little bit of blue up here for reasons I don't know. I can add the paint and paint on here. And the paint and the color selection won't interfere with each other. There's my paint job, there's my color selection job. Now, the final way to edit where we see this is by using smart masks. And these aren't found by right-clicking on your mask. They're found over here in their own little shelf. So as the name kind of implies, a smart mask, like a smart material, looks at all these maps that we've baked out and uses those to mask things out. So I'm going to delete these guys off of here very quickly. And it's gone back to full black, so again, we don't see that anywhere. Now, if we want to imagine that this is something that we only want where dirt would collect, so in the creases and then spilling up a little bit from that, I can choose this dirt dry. Like with materials and smart materials, I can apply this by just clicking and dragging it. There we are. So we can see it's got more of the blue showing up in the edges or anywhere that's shadowed, and then it kind of tapers off with a texture. So these smart masks are a really good way to quickly get grunge happening, and there's really a lot of them, so I recommend you test out a few different ones to see what they can all do. And then you've just got all kinds of different things that allow you to do all kinds of different effects. Once again, if we click on this mask editor, just like with a smart material, we can edit all of this. So we can come in here and change that. We can also invert the whole thing if we changed our mind and we actually want the white to be what's being hidden. And that's all with the smart masks, which are really super powerful, especially when combined with the smart materials and the materials. I'm going to go ahead and get painting and just start laying down some just basic materials. So I'll try to keep a pretty good pace so that we can move on to kind of what happens once you've got all your base textures done. So to start off, I'm going to double check just to make sure I know where I'm starting, and I'm going to grab the materials that seem to match closest to what I'm going for, and tweak just the color on those to make them look closer to what I'm looking for. Now, because of that two-tone effect the metal has, I'm going to add another smart mask, this time the darker brass, and then use one of the smart masks to make it only show up on the insides. And this isn't quite as sharp as I was hoping it would be, so I'm going to tweak that a few times just to make sure it's giving me what I'm looking for. So this isn't really quite it. I'm going to go ahead and try it with a different smart mask. And there we go, that one's a lot sharper, so if I make this a little darker, it should give kind of that contrast that I was looking for. Now I'm going to group these two and add a mask to my group. I group by hitting Control G, and then I'm going to add a mask with color selection and select that. And there we go. Now I did notice the inside of the rotary dial isn't that darker color. The screws are that same metal, so I'm going to color those. And I'm going to add a paint layer so that I can make the inner rotary tile not be the yellow or bronze and be the more silver color. So there we go, I selected that with the UV selector, and I'm ready to keep moving on. So for the plastic earpiece, I'm going to start with a rubber tire base, and now I just want to go in here and adjust the setting that changes those height bumps, because I want them to be there to give a little bit of breakup, but I don't want them to be quite so defined. So I'm going to use the levels that came with my smart material and tweak those up, or down as it were. And once again, I'm going to add a mask with color selection and choose just the rubber bits. That's not quite as specular as they are though, so I'm going to add a fill, and I'm going to turn off on this fill layer everything but the roughness. And that way I'm just filling this whole thing with a little bit of extra roughness. And since it's in my group, it's being masked like everything else is. And as you can see, I can select multiple things, so I'm also going to add the tip of that cord to get that in there. And now I'm going to move on to the handle. I'm going to start with this wood, which isn't at all the right color, but will give me the beginning of those wood lines. So I'm going to fiddle around with how the UVs are orientated and how they're projected onto my material to get kind of the look that I want. These lines are very, very straight, so I'm going to scale the UV unevenly to kind of force the wooden texture to make straight lines instead of those nice curvy ones we saw to begin with. And of course, I'm using that UV rotation to make sure they're rotated correctly. That's making a little too many lines. And once I've got those about where I want them to be, I'm going to add a fill, this time with just color to make it black. Because I want to keep all the other information from the wood the same, group those together, and once again, mask them with my ID mask. This is a little more irregular than what my photo looks like, so I'm going to tweak it a little bit, see if I can get it a little more faithful to the video, or to the photo, I mean. In the end, though, I do like my wood grain a little more. I think that looks a little more interesting when it's less machined, so I'll probably leave that in there a little bit. Now we're going to move on to the cord. I'm going to use this knitted sweater because it's a fabric cord. So as you can see, obviously here the knit pattern is far, far too big, so I'm going to just rotate it 90 degrees and then bump that UV scale up, up, up to get it smaller. I'm going to turn my fabric down to get that black color. Stick that in a group by itself, just that way I have a group to add more things to if I want, and add my good old color selection. And I've decided that it's not quite dark enough, so I'm going to add, once again, just a color layer in here. Check that out, looks pretty good. And now it's time for the phone's body. So I think I'm going to go with a polished metal, so I'm going to start with an aluminum, get that a little darker. And once again, you'll see I'm grouping it before I'm putting the selection. That way, if there's anything else I want to change, I can just add them in that group, and I don't have to worry about changing my mask for each different aspect of it. And this time, I'm going to try again, and instead of making my aluminum set to black, I'm going to set it to these clouds, because the way it looked when it was black was just too even. So I'm going to set it to those clouds, add a new fill that will be the black, and then over here, since I'm in my diffuse color, I can use that slider on the right to change the opacity of the layer. So I've put the black over my clouds, and I'm going to kind of fiddle with the balance of those to get it to look the way I want. So the clouds are there, but just very, very subtle. And once again, I'm going to kind of keep layering these one or two channels at a time to make sure that I get the end look that I want. And so I'm going to start for that inner rotary with the same material that I put on the rest of my phone. I made it into its own group though, so that I wouldn't have to worry about messing up the body of my phone while I'm testing out different smart masks. And I'm going to test out a few to see what I can get that will kind of naturally chip around the borders of this inner rotary dial. So this one's got the shape I want. I just need to invert it to make sure, there we go, that it's only coming off of the edges. And there we are. That's pretty good for the very basic sides of the front. And now we just need to get this kind of dusty colored piece in the middle. I'm going to collapse all this to clean it up a little bit. I'm going to grab the Rust Fine texture, which is a texture you'll see me use a lot because it just gives you some very nice noise, and you can change the color to make it look more or less rusty. So now, to keep the rust texture, I'm going to add this new texture up here that's just going to be my roughness and then maybe my metallic as well that I'll be tweaking. And so that allows me to change the look of this metal without messing with my rust texture underneath that I like. I am going to add a color though to dampen it out a little bit, and I tweaked the opacity of that. So what we got done here in the last 15 minutes was just basic texture work, but it did allow us to very quickly get these textures kind of started on the phone and get just some basic materials laid out. I'm going to go ahead and stop this video here, and I will have a part 2 in which I go over adding grunge to make this a little more interesting, make it look a little worn down, and using texture images and maps to get some more specific details on the object, like numbers around the rotary dial or the phone company logo on the back of this guy. So I'll see you all later for that.